Okay, so we finished with the skull. Now we're going to move on to the vertebrae or the vertebral column and the axial skeleton. We'll first do an introduction into the actual vertebral column as a whole, and then we'll break it down. We'll then learn about the lumbar spine in our next lecture. So in the vertebral column, in our diagram here, this is a lateral view. So if you were looking like at my spine, if I was to turn to the left, this would be a spine facing this way. We can see this would be the anterior and this would be the posterior. So I'm going to put this as a lateral view. This is the anterior over here. This is the posterior. Just to give you a point of reference. These projections that come off the back, these are called spinous processes. We'll learn more about that when we look at the lumbar vertebrae and our other vertebrae. But you can feel these spinous processes or bumps on the back of your neck or your upper shoulder, where your neck and your mid-back meet at your upper shoulder region. So this is the direction the spine takes. Now from a lateral view, we see that we have a curve that goes towards the front and the neck, and then towards the back and the middle of the back, and then again in the front, and the lower back, and then the base and the sacrum, it curves again to the back. These are called anterior to posterior curves, and these are normal, and we're going to talk about these in some more detail. Now, when we look at the spine, this is a posterior view. You can see the spinous processes here. If you look at the spine from a posterior view or an anterior view, like on the spinal model up here, this is the posterior view like on your diagram, you want it to be relatively straight up and down. These side-to-side curves like this would be called a lateral curve, and we want to avoid a lateral curve. That would be a bad thing. It's called scoliosis. So you guys may already know that. We'll talk more about that here in just a moment, but we're going to talk about the normal regions of the vertebrae and these normal anterior to posterior curves. Now, one other thing I want to mention before we get into that is when you look at the spine from this posterior view right here. This is a posterior view, but a lot of times you'll hear me refer to it as a P to A, or a posterior to anterior view. Or if you were to turn it around and look at it this way, this would be an anterior to posterior view. A lot of that has to do with X-ray imaging and how you're looking at things. But anyways, an anterior to posterior, posterior to anterior. And that's the way we'd look at that. So I'd write this here as a P to A view that way. Okay? Just to give us a reference point. Okay, so if we were to, let's tighten that up, good. Now if we're to look at it from a lateral view, this is the same as your diagram. This would be the anterior and this would be the posterior. I'm going to draw a diagram on the board and kind of talk a little bit about these curves and these regions and how we break all of this down. Now if you were to look at a lateral view as though we're facing this way, we're going to have a lateral view of the skull. So I'm going to put that this is our skull up here on a lateral view. So this right here would be the posterior or occipital bone. This right down here would be our anterior mandible. So that's the anterior, and so we're facing this way. We can put a little eye here with our nose, but that isn't, my artwork isn't that great. So here's our mandible, here's our occiput. I'll put that here. Occiput is there. Mandible is down there. So off of the skull, we're going to have the cervical spine come down this way. Then our thoracic spine curves this way. Then our lumbar spine back this way. And then our sacrum comes around this way. And then we'll talk about the coccyx. I'll put a little thicker line down there at the bottom. Now, in our top region, cervical spine, we can abbreviate this as CS for cervical spine. This would also be known as our neck region. And in the cervical spine, we always count 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way down. So starting at the top, we have 7 total vertebrae. And so we'll put in here 7 vertebrae. We'll talk more specifically about these individual cervical vertebrae in a later lecture. You can see here that it has a curve going to the anterior. So we'll put in our notes that it has an anterior convex curve. This anterior convex curve is called a lordosis. Okay. Some of this is also in the next slide in our notes, but we're just going to go ahead and combine it all together here. Last thing about this too, I want to point out, anytime you have the vertebrae, I can note specifically like C5, for instance. I could write it C5, I could say C6, C7, and so on. I could do the same with C1 through 4, and that's how we'd make a note on those. Okay. Now, once we get to C7, below that, now we get into our thoracic spine. Our thoracic spine has 12 vertebrae. Okay, so I'm going to write thoracic over here. Our thoracic spine, we can abbreviate as TS. We have 12 vertebrae. Okay, we can abbreviate them as T12. We could even, here, let me start with a lower number. We could say T1, we could say T6, then we could say T12 and make note on any of those. And that's how we do it. This has a posterior convex curve. This posterior convex curve is called a kyphosis. And it curves towards the posterior. Okay. Then we'll make our way into the lumbar spine. The lumbar spine has 5 vertebrae. Okay. We can abbreviate this as LS, like that. Put that we have 5 vertebrae. We can abbreviate them as L1, L4, L5. Okay. You'll notice that the lumbar spine has an anterior convex curve like the cervical spine. Just like in the cervical spine, this is called a lordosis. Then, to kind of backtrack a little bit, our thoracic spine, like I told you up here in the cervical spine, the cervical is referred to as the neck. The thoracic spine would be considered the mid-back. I'll write this over to the side. The lumbar spine is considered the lower back. And then at the base here, we have what's called the sacrum. The sacrum, or you could call it the sacral spine. We refer to that usually as SAC is how we abbreviate that. This is considered the base of the spine. And this is made up of 5 fused vertebrae. So they're fused together into a triangular plate. It does have a posterior convex curve. And just like the thoracic spine, this is referred to as a kyphosis. Okay. We can abbreviate the sacral spine. We can say S1, S2, just like we've done throughout the rest of the vertebrae. Okay. Then the last thing we'll talk about at the very distal end of the vertebral column is this region right here called the coccyx. We can also call this the coccygeal region. We would abbreviate this as COC. We usually don't make note about coccygeal vertebra or coccygeal bone 1, 2, and 3. That's just usually not something we do. The coccyx is a vestigial tail, or it's called our tail bone, so we'll put in here, this is our tail bone. During falls where you land on the gluteal region on the buttocks, you can fracture the tailbone. A lot of times you can fracture multiple of these bones in here. The coccyx is different, but it usually is 3 to 5 fused bones. And they're not vertebrae, they're like little tailbones that you would see in an animal with a tail. And they're not of your normal nature of the other tailbones and other animals because they're vestigial, they're leftover, they're carryover from deletion of the tail through evolution. So that's the way that works. So these anterior to posterior curves, what's important about these is they create this almost like spring-like nature within the vertebral column. When you look at the vertebral column, in between the vertebrae we have these thick fibrocartilaginous discs called intervertebral disc, or IVD. They do shock absorption. These curves from front to back help create a spring-like nature within the vertebrae that help protect the vertebral disc and help stabilize and distribute force that goes down through the spine. Okay. All right. Now, to finish up with this idea of curves, if we were to take an anterior to posterior view, so let's say we have an A to P view. So my attempt here, I'll draw a skull, try to anyways. Put some eyes, a little nose up here, some teeth, my lovely artwork. But anyways, normally what we want to see is a spine that is straight up and down, right, with no curves. So here we have the sacrum. I'm going to go ahead and add the hip bones this way, right? So here's our hips, or these would be our iliac bones. Up here, I'm going to put some shoulder blades like this. These would be scapula. Now, the reason I draw this as our reference, we want the top of the iliac bones, the iliac crest. Let me draw a little bit better one here. We want these to be even across here. We don't want one to be higher than the other. And we want our scapula or shoulder blades to be even. We don't want one to be hiked up higher than the other. And then we want our skull to be level too. We want our eyes to be level with the ground, not our head tilted over to the side. So from an A to P view, we want a straight up and down spine like this, like you can see in this diagram right here. No lateral curves. If we do put lateral curves in, we're going to end up with a structure where this curves off like this. When we do this, this will cause an increase of shoulder blade height on one side. It will cause this sacrum to be tilted to one side. We'll have a hip bone that's higher than another, like this. And so this will create lateral curves. These lateral curves from side to side is called a scoliosis. We'll just talk briefly about scoliosis. This is a bad thing. This puts pressure on the intervertebral discs. This causes a lot of pulling on muscles. It causes the rib cage to rotate, and these rib angles that we'll talk about later tend to become bulging out. And it creates a situation that's very uncomfortable in the spine. In scoliosis, you can see a single curve, but in a lot of cases, when you start to put a curve in the spine, you get what's called a secondary curve within the spine to help balance it out, because our main goal when you put these other curves in there, it won't end up balancing the shoulder blades or the hips out, so you still have a lot of pain and pressure here in the spine. But the goal is to create these secondary curves so your eyes stay level with the horizontal, so you're balanced and equilibrium. So this lateral curves would be called a scoliosis, and that's where we're going to stop with the scoliosis discussion. And that's actually where we'll end our introduction to the vertebrae. And then the next lecture, we'll go on and talk about the lumbar vertebrae, or a typical vertebrae.